Hi everyone, welcome to the Judge Test results presentation for our Commendum Open 2021. I will specifically discuss about part 3, in this case about a debate assessment that you were tasked to provide an OA for. Though we only expect you to provide an OA, but we will also discuss about the scoring, so independent adjudicators can be more aware of the standards that we are using and also the appropriate scoring for each speaker. So without further ado, let's go to the ranking that the EdgeCore settled with. So rankings go as follow. The first goes to closing government, second to opening a position, third to opening government, and fourth to closing a position. We will discuss the reasonings one by one. So yeah, let's go. Reasoning, we will start with closing a position first. So the reason that why we think closing a position got fourth there are four main reasons, especially that we are going to compare directly CO with all the other teams. So it will be much clearer that why compared to the other three, CO just couldn't get above them. So firstly, let's talk about CO's main contribution in the debate, which are two things, right? The use of mercenaries will only benefit rich countries and will only dehumanize the forces that are being deployed. However, as an average reasonable person, you may ask things and you may pose a basic burden to these contributions, because eventually these 2 points were not elaborated to a further extent. What is the harm of rich countries getting benefited? What do the benefits even look like? What is the humanization of mercenary forces? Why this dehumanization is different with deploying your own military forces? So we feel like the harms, though valid and though logical, were not explained in a way that it could further elaborate that why then these harms are very exclusive, that why these harms are necessarily more dangerous than the other harms that were already explained by the OO, for example. So their contributions alone did not manifest into a clear-cut conclusion that we can directly compare with other teams, right? So let's compare one by one. Compared to CG, we think that CO failed to respond to a huge chunk of CG's contributions, such as private contractors have the interest to hire the best possible individuals and to make sure that they conduct all operations well because their employment relies on such, which basically says that these companies would want to have a good operation. Otherwise, if they don't have good operations, then they would have a bad reputation. So therefore, no countries or no employers would want to use their services, right? This was successful in debunking OO's points, but more on this later. But we think that closing opposition as a direct opposition to closing government had responsibility to respond to this characterization, but because it was non-existent, that's why we think that closing opposition is not able to get over closing government. So compared to opening a position, we think that CO did not manage to frame that why the harms, those ones that I mentioned earlier about benefiting rich countries, dehumanizing forces, but why then these harms are more paramount than what OO talk about? For example, mercenaries tend to be dominated by ex-soldiers who got discharged dishonorably and with PTSD. Therefore, using their services might lead to more repercussions, such as the revenge-based activities in the war zone, etc., which also responded to a lot of OG's points. So that's why we think that closing a position, would have the burden to really explain that why the harms are more important, if not the most important harm in the debate, compared to what OO has established. And because of that, we think that opening a position, since they managed to engage better with their with opening government, we think that closing opposition didn't manage to really set themselves apart with their opening. So therefore, compared to the opening opposition, they also fell short. And lastly, compared to OG, while we think that most of OG's points were debunked by the opening opposition, we think that CO didn't manage to really debunk another points of urgency coming from OG about solving conflicts in the most efficient manner. Because OG did argue about mercenaries will not be politicized, they will have more forces to deploy, then more conflict should be solved at the same time. We think that closing opposition focused too much on their contributions, but then eventually these contributions was not explained in a way that it would debunk the urgency and also the characterization that was already brought by both OG and CG. So that's why we think that compared to the other three teams, the closing opposition just did not manage to get over them. So now let's go to the third place, in this case, opening government, and why they got third. While OG was able to bring several important points, such as conflicts need to be solved in an efficient manner that only mercenaries can provide due to their focus on getting things done. They will not be politicized and whatnot. Unfortunately, they weren't mechanized and characterized properly. They were just said as assertions, that, oh, mercenaries focus on getting things done. So therefore, all of the good stuff will happen because they have the interest to make sure that they get things done, right? But it wasn't properly explained that why just because you want to get things done, then everything will be good, which was challenged by the opening opposition, because eventually opening opposition was able to characterize the types of individuals that will be deployed on the field, people who have committed war crimes, veterans with PTSD, which weakens the efficacy that OG promised and never mechanized in terms of likelihood and impact. So that's why we think that though the opening oppositions were somewhat, especially the leader of opposition was somewhat simplistic as well in explaining that, oh, these are the types of people that they're going to hire. So therefore, it's going to create harms for the conflicts that you are involved in. But we think that at least there was an attempt to really characterize what types of people going to be engaged and going to be hired by the mercenary companies, in this case, private contractors. And we think that opening government did not manage to debunk that characterization. Instead, they focus on a lot that, oh, they focus on get things done. They will things get better. They will get things done in an efficient and also in a positive manner. Didn't really address that the likelihood as well, that or at least managed to explain that there's a slim chance, or at least there is a likelihood that the execution will not go the way that OG wanted. So that's why OO wins over OG. And then comparing OG and CG, right? We think that CG managed to mechanize a large chunk of OG's points that OG failed to do. For example, CG explained that the mercenaries will have the inherent interest to make sure that they operate efficiently and also positively to some certain extent, i.e. not committing war crimes, not only out of duty, like what OG said, but because they need to have a good reputation in order to be hired again by another country, by the same country whenever there are conflicts, because they need to maintain profitability, right? So therefore, there is an interest to make sure that the operations that they are assigned to will be always carried out positively due to this interest, which explains the likelihood that was missing in opening government, that why it's more than just duty, but it's also because there is an interest to make sure that things had to run as good as possible. Additionally, we think that though OG talk about mercenaries will not be politicized, but CG extended this by saying that mercenaries will not be politicized because they are not necessarily the citizens of the country who will be employing the mercenary services. This means it's also easier to shape the narrative to the society that while conflicts are atrocious, we need to be involved. And the good thing is we don't have to sacrifice our own people, so we are using outsourcing, in this case, mercenaries. This extends further OG's points in a way that lack of politicization is not a benefit per se, like what OG argued, but the subsequent effect of them being not politicized leads to the conflict resolution that OG did not mechanize, that will not have to be a partisan issue, for example, or a politicization that will only be opposed by the people in that country. So we think that CG managed to mechanize most of OG's points that were not manifested into anything concrete, we have to say. So that's why opening government got third compared to both OO and also CG. So now comparing the top two teams and why we think that eventually the opening opposition got the second place and subsequently closing government got the first place. We think that OO was successful in characterizing ways of mercenaries, the way they work, the types of people they want to hire. The harms are enough to debunk OG's points and to be framed as more important than what CO brought. However, while the impact is clear, the likelihood is still questionable because OO jumped to the worst possible scenario without characterizing the way of the likelihood. I'm sorry for the mistake. Yeah, the grammatical error. But anyway, Therefore, when CG argued why it will be within the interest of the company to always hire the best people and train them in the best way because it will result in more employment, it explains that OO's claims that these companies would commit atrocious crimes or whatnot are less likely to happen. Therefore, also reducing the possibility of harms they posited. So while the harms are there, while you can feel the impact, but the likelihood was already cut off, meaning that the possibility of the harms to happen are minimum, if not non-existent, because of CG's characterization. So therefore, we have to credit CG because of that. Additionally, CG also argued that states, which OO defends as the best actor to deploy armed forces, in this case using their own military forces, tend to cover up their mistakes or war crimes because they have the interest to maintain their image and soft power. This explains that why states will be more likely to commit war crimes, and not only that, but to also hide them later, which directly debunks OO's claims about states being a more reasonable actor, being an easier actor to be involved in conflicts. And we think that the characterization coming from CG about these countries, because they really cannot control how things are done in the field, for example, if something happened, then states would want to cover things up because they want to still be seen as a good country who is involved in a conflict, meaning that if something happens, they will hide things up. So we think that it explains that why OO's claims about state being a more reasonable actor to deploy their own military forces is not necessarily a benefit. Finally, CG also managed to explain that states can supervise better because now that they do not have to cover things up, they can focus on supervising the mercenaries so they will not commit atrocious crimes. Had these mercenaries done so, they can just be replaced with another contractor. Therefore, all players in the market, any other mercenaries, any other private contractors in the market will have to compete in a way who is able to provide the best service that complies with the principle of just war, for example. This also directly debunks OO's harms because OO failed to explain the likelihood. CG's characterizations managed to prove otherwise, and hence CG wins. That would be for the OA and also for the reasoning behind that, behind the rankings, right? So let's go to the scoring. So for scoring, Prime Minister 77, we think that the speech is generally clear to follow. The PM also managed to establish the urgency of why mercenaries are important in the context of modern warfare, which addresses the core issue of the debate. But since some arguments do slip into deficits, i.e. incomplete characterization and likelihood analysis, the PM score fits within the range of 76 to 78, right in the middle range, right? DPM, however, deserves a 75 because while the speech is generally clear enough to follow, the contents did not address the core points of LO's harm, other than saying, oh, well, if OO's claims are about, or if OO's concerns are about the recruitment or the way we train them, we can fix that without explaining the process of fixing that and the likelihood of how it can be fixed, given that OO has already established quite the characterization that why most likely it's going to be hard because the people that you are hiring are the people that have specific criteria that might hamper the operations. Additionally, some points said by the DPM have been established by the Prime Minister. And we think that repetitions is not the same with framing, right? So therefore, the DPM fits the criteria of the average score range, which is 73 to 75. And they do deserve the higher end because clear enough to follow, arguments are relevant still, but fail to address one or more core issues, especially if we take into account the way they respond to the leader of opposition. So that's why for opening a position, for opening a position, the leader of opposition deserves a 77 to 78 range. The speech is generally clear to follow. The LO also managed to, the LO also managed to establish the harms of hiring mercenaries, which addresses the core issue in the debate, especially in response to opening government. Since some arguments still slip into deficits, incomplete characterization, that why then most likely these are the types of people that mercenaries would like to hire. The LO score fits within this range, but can be higher than PM considering the LO's response tackles some of PM's points. So if you want to credit that response, you can give them 78 and then the Prime Minister 77. But if you feel like they're equal, we think that it could also be the case. So we can give them both 77. DPM, however, deserves an 80 because they managed to extend the harms brought by leader of opposition, framed in a way that OG failed and also the LO failed. The several characterizations that were missing in LO were evident in Deputy Leader of Opposition. There are examples about the Blackwater incident also helped solidify the OO standing in the debate, especially compared to OG. So that's why we think that due to their relevance in the debate, how they were able to address the core issue, extending the harms brought by the leader of opposition. So that's why we think that DPM deserves this scoring range. And we would say that they were around the middle, which is in this case 80. So now to the closing government, aka the winner of the debate, we gave member of government 79 because we think that the MG was able to frame several important points in the debate, such as the institutionalization of mercenaries may result in them being regulated and supervised. So which kind of paved the way that why OO's likelihood is then not evident. While comparatively better than the leader of opposition, we think that member of government still scores lower than the deputy leader of opposition due to member of government's lack of direct response. We think that the characterizations are important, and though excellent, we think that they were sporadic in a way that it doesn't really address the core issue brought by the deputy leader opposition. So that's why we think that they were on the lower end of this range, especially that the DLO is also within that range. So we think it's only fair to provide the member of government a slightly lower score than the deputy leader of opposition. The government whip, however, we think that they deserve the highest end on this range, in this case 82, because they managed to thread MG's responses, MG's characterization into specific framing that entirely debunks OO's case. So not only that they were responding to the DLO and to the opening opposition and also to the closing opposition, they were able to like thread and collect all of the points brought by the member of government and then incorporate these characterizations by the member to destroy the entire case. So which we think is a good example of a framing that why then it's not only about you providing immediate response, but it's also about you threading all of the things that have been said by your previous speaker in the debate that could be in your own advantage. So that's why we think that this is an example of a good speech that focuses more on framing, not just repetitions, and why their characterizations triumph over the other teams by clearly explaining how they would manifest. So that's why the government whip deserves a score of 82, which also makes the government whip to be the best speaker of the round. Finally, closing opposition, we think that the member of opposition deserves a 75 because while they did posit relevant harms, they didn't really address the characterizations from member of government. And we think that member of opposition also failed to frame that why these harms are more important than opening opposition's harms. So while they are logical, they can be credited as somewhat simplistic, especially the debate has evolved in the closing bench due to closing government's contribution. So that's why we think that closing opposition, in this case, the member of opposition, had the burden to at least respond and to at least debunk CG's point, because in BP, even though it's not exactly responded, doesn't mean that point is not strong enough. Some points might be just too strong to be responded, and that's exactly what's happening in the debate, at least according to me. So that's why I think that member of opposition failed to do just that. Sorry, that should be opposition whip. So opposition whip deserves a 74 because while the we think that the opposition whip fits the middle of this range, because while they were able to explain the manifestation of harms explained by the member of opposition, but due to their simplistic response to CG's sophistication, especially the way the government whip framed the entire debate, threading the entire debate, opposition whip, who had more time and chances to craft responses, couldn't be credited as much. So that's why we think that they're on the middle end of this range, which is 73 to 75. So that would be the session regarding judge test results for the video exhibition. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us in the WhatsApp group or anything. We're going to open the floor if you have questions or just to clarify. Yeah. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye-bye.